Good evening, everyone. This is William Moore, and you are watching Beyond the Ties That Bind. Tonight, I'd like to talk about the gun rally which took place in the Commonwealth of Virginia the other day. I was watching a lot of videos from the event, and one thing that continually kept popping up was people talking about the founding fathers, the framers of the country, the framers of the Constitution of the United States. People would talk about how if the founding fathers were here today, they would not be putting up with this. They would be in disagreement with what the Virginia legislature is trying to do. They're rolling over in their graves right now at the thought of the Virginia legislature saying that no weapons would be allowed on the Capitol grounds during the rally. So I want to address some of that because that's just not true. The founding fathers, as people call them, were not motivated by the thought of protecting individual liberty or personal freedoms. They were motivated by their own economic interest. The founding fathers um, would have stood with the Virginia legislature um, and would have agreed with them that they had the right to restrict certain uses of firearms as it related to personal use. They would have been okay with the fact that the Virginia legislature, the governor, prohibited people from carrying weapons onto the Capitol grounds. They would have been fine with that. We need to go back and examine what took place back in the late 1700s and look at documents and letters, look at quotes in their original context, and also not rely upon quotes that we cannot find any kind of authentication for. There's a lot of people out there. I used to have a shirt. It said basically about the Second Amendment being the people's liberty's teeth, or weapons being the people's liberty's teeth. That quote was falsely attributed to George Washington. He never said any such thing. When I found that out, I used the shirt to dry off my vehicle and then tossed it in the garbage that day. Because for me, this is all about a search for truth. But going back to the framers, they did not have the interest of the common everyday person at heart. We are told that the United States Constitution is a freedom document. We are told that the framers were interested in establishing a nation to where individual liberty trumped tyranny. That's not true. We are told that the Constitution restrains government and protects individual rights, when in fact it restrains individual rights and protects government. These men set up a central government, a strong central government with unlimited power of taxation, and gave themselves within the document the mechanisms to collect these taxes through coercion. So these men were not interested at all in individual liberty or personal freedoms. We're told that James Madison is the father of the Constitution, when in fact George Clymer, and you can look this up, you can check this out, George Clymer was the one responsible for writing most of the Constitution. Now, James Madison helped in the amendment process with the Bill of Rights. He oversaw the original 12 amendments to the Bill of Rights. Yes, there were 12 amendments at one time. Two were not accepted or ratified, if you want to use that word. Um, So he oversaw the language in the amendments. And as we've talked about, amendments mean absolutely nothing. They're an addition to a document, and just as easily as an addition can be made to a document, a subtraction can be made to that document. Just as easily. Look at the time in the 1920s of during the time of Prohibition, how they passed an amendment to um, make alcohol illegal. Um, and then, of course, they retracted that a few years later. And all of this is um, the oversight is by the government. And the decision process as to what amendments are added, what amendments are taken away, is determined by the government. Many people say, well, the United States Constitution, it was a God breathed, inspired document, inspired by heaven. It's a secular document. It is a secular document, and it establishes a new sovereign, not the creator of the universe, but we the people. And when it talks about we the people, it's talking about the legislature. It's talking about the branches of government, such as the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branches of government. In their lack of forethought, the framers of the Constitution did not consider judicial review. So all laws of the land are now determined by the Supreme Court. And a majority of 5 in the Supreme Court can determine whether a law stands or whether a law falls. Um, so that's a majority of 5, meaning a minority of 5 people can determine what is right or wrong for the rest of the 330 million people in the fiction known as the United States of America. So, uh, this document that so many people, well, there's a lot of people that worship the document. There's a lot of people that revere the document. I don't. It's just a piece of paper. There are many pieces of paper more valuable to me than the Constitution. When I make a shopping list every week to go to Fresh Time or Kroger, that piece of paper is more valuable to me than the worthless Constitution, because the Constitution doesn't protect rights. Even the Bill of Rights doesn't protect rights. Look at the 10th Amendment, how that was trampled after 1865 by the courts. And then it was determined that states did not have a right to secede. Look at how the different amendments in the Constitution are trampled all of the time. So it's worthless. Like Lysander Spooner stated, either the Constitution gave us the government that we now have, or it was powerless to prevent the government we now have. Either way, it is unfit to exist. Um, So there are a lot of people talking about the framers, talking about rights, individual rights, and liberties at the rally. Um, but I want to go back and look into the mind of the men that are called the founding fathers. As stated, I don't call them the founding fathers; they are the framers. And I want to just kind of get into their mindset and see what these men actually were thinking. Um, if we go back, I'm going to be reading from some excerpts from Conspiracy in Philadelphia, The Broken Covenant of the United States Constitution by Gary North. I love this book because of the history it gives, but I do not agree with Mr. North, his conclusion that we need to have a theocracy. I'm completely against a theocracy. But anyway, I do want to read a quote in here, and it is from the preface Forrest McDonald's pluribus unum, the formation of the American Republic, 1776 to 1790. And it states, the first function of the founders of nations, after the founding itself, is to devise a set of true falsehoods about origins, a mythology that will make it desirable for nationals to continue to live under common authority and, indeed, make it impossible for them to entertain contrary thoughts. So, make it impossible for them to question the uh, the stories surrounding the formation of the nation, such as George Washington and the cherry tree. That one would be a miraculous event for it to even have happened. First of all, as we know, the story goes that George Washington's dad comes in the house and he says, "Hey, who chopped down the cherry tree?" And George Washington says, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down the cherry tree." And so instead of getting a whipping, he gets honored for being honest and telling the truth, um, which is quite funny because in order for that to have happened, George Washington would have had to have been a master at wielding an axe at 18 months old. And he would have had to have a mastery of the English language at 18 months old because his father passed away shortly thereafter. This story was made up by Washington and a man who was helping Washington with his autobiography to make it look like, from the beginning, George Washington could not tell a lie, when actually, to the end, he could. Um, so, and Paul Revere and the Midnight Ride, that did not happen. Also, that George Washington was a great commander, fearless man, courageous. He was a coward. And we'll get into that later, and I'll prove that through documentation, historical documentation. The only battle that Washington won, he actually just kind of fell into. Kind of like walking across the field, falling into a hole, and inside that hole's a bunch of gold and silver. It just happened by chance. But we'll look at that later, and we'll discuss that. We'll discuss who George Washington really was. But anyway, there was a problem at the time of the Constitutional Convention. The problem was they were operating under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation did not contain enough power. They did not contain the power of taxation and the power to collect the taxes. Did not contain anything that allowed Hamilton and Madison and Washington to pay off the bankers for the war that was just fought. So anyway, what had transpired was something called Shays' Rebellion. We don't hear a lot about Shays' Rebellion, but it's actually a very important event within the history of the country. And Shays' Rebellion took place in Massachusetts. It was an armed uprising in western Massachusetts in opposition to a debt crisis among the citizenry and the state government's increased efforts to collect taxes both on individuals and their trades. The fight took place mostly in and around Springfield during 1786 and 1787. So, the reason that we had Shays' Rebellion was the fact that the government at the time, the Continental Congress, was issuing script in order to pay off the debt incurred at the war. They were issuing script, and so they would pay the men who actually helped fight in the War of Independence with this script, and it was worthless. Then they would go to these men and they would try and collect taxes. And the men would say, okay, well, here, we'll pay our taxes in this script. And the government said, well, that's worthless. We don't accept that. We want it paid in gold and silver, gold or silver. Well, the people are like, wait a minute. You're paying us in this script, but then you won't accept it for tax payment? So we had a rebellion. We had Shays' Rebellion. Actually, at the time, Thomas Jefferson was very he thought that Shays' Rebellion was a good thing. Um, but you know, then of course they used Shays' Rebellion as an opportunity to bring about a solution. It was a crisis, and they had to go. You know, some of them had to use this event and go into a crisis mode so we could create a stronger central government that gave us unlimited powers of taxation and gave us the mechanisms to collect the taxes after we impose these taxes upon the people. So, Shays' Rebellion took place. Invitations went out to the Constitutional Convention. Samuel Adams was against it. Patrick Henry was against it. George Mason was against it. Um, and Patrick Henry, when he received his invitation, he refused to go to the Constitutional Convention. He said, "I smell a rat," and right he was. As stated, George Clymer was the one who actually wrote most of the Constitution. Madison actually helped in the amendment process. But even in the amendment process, the Second Amendment, what people don't understand, a lot of conservatives try and use or a lot of people who believe in gun rights try and use the Second Amendment and state that it's a uh, unlimited, unrestricted right as far as the founders were concerned, and that's not true. As we talked about, James Madison did not believe that the states had the right to rebel and use arms against the federal government. He believed that the Second Amendment, and so did the courts at the time, believed that the Second Amendment only pertained to people having arms in order to be part of a militia that would defend the Union. Also, James Madison, when he was in the Virginia legislature, proposed a law which was supposed to protect deer. And in this law, no person could have a weapon outside of their property line for personal use. That it had to be confined within their property as far as bearing an arm. So everything that we're told is nothing more than a lie. But the law was basically to protect deer. You couldn't hunt out of season. So imagine back then. I mean, I know we have hunting seasons today, which. If I believe if a person's hungry, if their family's hungry, they should be able to kill an animal anytime they need to provide for the needs of their family. But back then, I mean, that was one of the main tools, hunting, that you would use to get food. So, could you imagine back then? You're starving, your family's starving, and there's a deer, and you're like, "Well, sorry, honey, sorry, kids. James Madison says that that would be against the law for me to shoot that deer." And people think that these people were somehow defenders of personal freedom. Anyway, so we had Shays' Rebellion, and it was a rebellion against taxation. And then from that, they convened this uh, constitutional convention illegally. It was illegally done because the Articles of Confederation did not call for complete scrapping of the document, and it would take a unanimous vote of all 13 colonies in order to even add an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. So they went in there they went into the convention knowing that they were going to scrap the Articles of Confederation and come up with a new document. That is a coup d'etat. That's basically a revolution. So what they were doing was illegal according to the laws. They were breaking their own law or breaking their own flaw. It was far more illegal than what Daniel Shays did in Massachusetts, despite the fact that Shays' Rebellion in late 1786 and early 1787 was a major motivating factor in George Washington's last-minute decision to attend the Constitutional Convention. Without this decision, the convention would probably have failed. What is more, the framers knew that they were acting illegally. Shays' rebellion had provided an opportunity for a majority of a group of 55 men, more than half of whom were lawyers, to break the law of the land and get away with it. This is not how historians of the Constitution have created have treated. I'm sorry. This is not how historians of the Constitution have treated the convention in Philadelphia. This fact provides additional support for the ancient rule of historiography. Indeed, its only known rule. The victors write the textbook. I'm going to read that last paragraph again. So this is not how historians of the Constitution have treated the convention in Philadelphia. This fact provides additional support for the ancient rule of historiography. Indeed, its only known rule. The victors write the textbook. So the victors write the textbooks. And we've been sold a bill of goods, a pig in a poke, if you will, concerning the Constitution. You have 55 men, half of them lawyers, half of them bankers, getting together to decide the fate for all of the people within the 13 colonies. Now, how can any good come about when you have a meeting of 55 bankers or 55 men, half of which are bankers, the other half attorneys? No good can come of anything like that. These men were there to protect their own economic interest. So, I also want to read a little bit about the thrust behind getting rid of the Articles of Confederation and what Madison actually thought, what was going on in his mind. It had nothing to do with freedom. It had nothing to do with securing the rights of individuals when it came to a constitution. It had to do with taxation and the power to collect those taxes through the use of force. That's why you have a United States Constitution. It has nothing to do with your rights. For one, the United States Constitution was ratified, or well, illegally ratified, months before the Bill of Rights ever came into existence. The Bill of Rights is a rider to the Constitution, added because of compromise. They had to add it, or else Patrick Henry would have probably fought to his last breath, and he could have taken them all on. He would have fought to his last breath to prevent the document ever becoming law. And then, of course, you have a man like Samuel Adams, who it was not beyond him to resort to violence if need be, if he was so motivated to do so. So that's why you have a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. The Constitution is nothing more than, it's not amendments, it's nothing more than you have articles, sections, and clauses. Most people, when they talk about the Constitution, they're only talking about the amendments, which the 14th Amendment is criminal in itself, and that's a show for, that's a topic for another show, definitely. But, so they get together because they want to scrap the Articles. So what's wrong with the Articles of Confederation? According to Madison and the critics, it was the absence of sanctions. There was no power to tax and compel payment. Also, there was no executive who can enforce sanctions. In Madison's letter to George Washington, he insisted, this is Madison's words, a national executive must also be provided. In like manner, the right of coercion should be expressly declared. Well, we had a program just the other day where I gave you the definition of coercion. It's the use of force or threats to get what you want. Here we have Madison, who people think is some stalwart of freedom, and the man was he was a tyrant. He wanted to have the power to coerce people to use the threat of force in order to get money from them, in order to control them. If they didn't comply with the government's wishes, he had no problem with the use of coercion to get what he wanted, or to allow the government to get what they wanted. Um, it's really it's sad. It's sad. We're told from the beginning that this document is a document which protects our freedom. Um, it says it grants our rights. It does not grant any rights whatsoever. Of course, then we have the Christians who state that it's an inspired document when nowhere is the creator even mentioned. Now, if the creator was going to inspire a document, wouldn't he take the time to reveal himself in that document, reveal his identity, like he did with Israel and the Torah? So, anyway, I want to read here from a book, uh, once again, um, Conspiracy in Philadelphia by Gary North. And in this part of the book, I wish this was something that everyone would read. I wish this was something that everyone would study to pull the scales, the patriotic scales, off of their eyes, or to allow those scales to fall off. The General Federal Convention that framed the Constitution at Philadelphia was a secret body. Think about that. And the greatest pains were taken that no part of its proceedings should get to the public until the Constitution itself was reported to Congress. The journals were confided to the care of George Washington and were not made public until many years after our present government was established. The framers of the Constitution ignored the purposes for which they were delegated. They were delegated to discuss amendments to the Articles of Confederation. They acted without any authority whatever, and the document, which the warring factions finally evolved from their quarrels and dissensions, was revolutionary. The capital fact requires iteration, for it is essential to an understanding of the desperate struggle to secure the ratification of that then unpopular instrument. As stated, it was very unpopular. That's why you have the Anti-Federalist Papers. That's why you have such arguments. Patrick Henry, made a just a wonderful speech against adopting the Constitution because it squinted toward monarchy. It gave a very small minority of people power over all the people in the country. Um, it was an unpopular document, and that's not the prevailing view in the textbooks concerning the Constitution. It's rarely mentioned in specialized academic monographs on the Constitution how unpopular it was. The historians have accepted the mythology of the convention itself, a mythology that prevailed only because James Madison was a master political manipulator. He did his work well, both at the convention and through the state ratification conventions. But it was George Washington's letter to Congress at the close of the convention which did more than anything else to move the conspiracy from a coup to successful revolution. So, this is probably one of the most significant letters in American history that I'm about to read you, and it's from George Washington. And we have now the honor to submit to the consideration of the United States in Congress assembled that Constitution which has appeared to us the most advisable. The friends of our country have long seen and desired that the power of making war, peace, and treaties, that of levying money, aka taxation, and regulating commerce and the correspondent executive and judicial authorities should be fully and effectually vested in the general government of the Union. But the impropriety of delegating such extensive trust to one body of men is evident. Hence results the necessity of a different organization, different than what they had for the first 11 years under the Articles of Confederation. It is obviously impractical that the federal government of these states, to secure all rights of independent sovereignty to each, and yet provide for the interest and safety of all, individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. Okay, who does that sound like? That sounds like George W. a few years ago. The magnitude of the sacrifice must depend as well on situation and circumstance as on the object to be obtained. It is at all times difficult to draw with precision the line between those rights which must be surrendered and those which may be reserved. And on the present occasion, this difficulty was increased by a difference among the several states as to their situation, extent, habits, and particular interest. In all our deliberations on this subject, we kept steadily in our view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our Union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence. This important consideration, seriously and deeply impressed on our minds, led each state in the convention to be less rigid on points of inferior magnitude that might have been otherwise expected. And thus the Constitution which we now present is the result of a spirit of amity and of that mutual difference and concession which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. That it will meet the full and entire approbation of every state is not perhaps to be expected, but each will doubtlessly consider that had her interests been alone consulted, the consequences might have been particularly disagreeable or injurious to others, that it is liable to as few exceptions as could reasonably have been expected. We hope and believe that it may promote the lasting welfare of that country so dear to us all, and secure her freedom and happiness is our most ardent wish. Okay, something I want to read through here again. Um, to secure all rights of independent sovereignty to each, and yet provide for the interest and safety of all, individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. This guy was not a defender of freedom. The magnitude of the sacrifice must depend as well on situation and circumstance as on the object to be obtained. It is at all times difficult to draw with precision the line between those rights which must be surrendered and those which may be reserved. People, these men were tyrants. Jefferson and Madison did not want guns on their college. Um, they didn't want guns on their campus. In October of 1824, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison attended a board meeting of the University of Virginia, which would open the following spring. Jefferson and Madison had spent not a little time thinking about individual liberties, but minutes from the meeting showed that their new school would not extend the right to bear arms to its red brick grounds. No student shall, within the precincts of the university, introduce, keep, or use any spirituous or vinous liquors, keep or use weapons or of arms of any kind. So you couldn't even have gunpowder. Actually, it goes on to say you couldn't have gunpowder on you. So when we try and cite the uh, framers and say that they believed in individual liberty and personal freedoms, they didn't. So we need to quit using these men and holding them in such high esteem. There were a few of the men who helped form this country who believed in individual liberty and believed in personal freedom, that being Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, George Mason, and Thomas Jefferson to an extent. Now, his Tree of Liberty quotation, which people talk about all the time and misquote and abuse, um, actually had to do with Shays' Rebellion. He thought that it was a good thing. However, when we look at Thomas Jefferson later on, even though he had some objections to certain parts of the Constitution, once he became president, he actually wound up using some of those parts of the Constitution that he initially objected to for his own power. So he was pretty hypocritical in that manner, and it just goes to show that when a person gets power, the power corrupts, and then they want more power. So the quote is actually, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. Our convention has been too much impressed by the insurrection of Massachusetts, and in the spur of the moment they are setting up a kite to keep the hen yard in order. I hope in God this article will be reflected before the new Constitution is accepted." So basically, what Jefferson was saying is that it's a good thing that the Tree of Liberty needs to be refreshed. And a lot of people believe that, and I'm one of them. If you read the entire letter, that when he was talking about tyrants, he was not talking about well, we know that he wasn't talking about the King of England. He was actually talking about George Washington. So, anyway, Thomas Jefferson does have some really good quotes as far as liberty is concerned. But at the same time, when he got into power, he no longer held to his beliefs. He actually used some of the things in the Constitution that he disagreed with for his own purposes. So we need to get away from acting as if our rights are dependent upon this piece of paper. They're not. Our rights are given to us by our Creator, and it's our own responsibility to preserve and protect and defend those rights. It's nobody else's, and you definitely don't want to hand over the responsibility of protecting your rights to a group of psychopaths in Washington, D.C. Because when it comes right down to it, we, the people, that sovereign that was established by the Constitution, that new sovereign, not the Creator, he's nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. Sorry to break that one to you, Christians, but he's not mentioned. Um, Also, if you go to the Treaty of Tripoli, uh, George Washington even stated in the Treaty of Tripoli that this is not a Christian nation. Its foundation is not Christian. So, I mean, wake up. Um, uh, get over yourself. Um, we need to establish truth, um, and we need to get away from thinking this document ensures our freedoms, protects our freedoms, because it doesn't. It's a document that puts the power in the hands of the people within Congress. And because they didn't even have the forethought at the time of how this was going to break down, like I stated earlier, 5 members of the Supreme Court decide what is right and wrong for everyone, and that is complete ludicrous. You have the right to have a weapon. Any weapon the government can have. If you can afford a nuke, you can have one. I'm telling you that there's no group of people that have that are divine, that have the authority to have something that you can't have. Okay, I'm going to end with something that Brian from um, High Impact Flicks says all the time. No one has a higher claim to your life and property than you. And how I interpret that is that it is also, now nobody can tell you what to do, nobody can defend um, your rights except you, and that it is your responsibility to defend, protect those rights, and determine what rights that you're willing to die for. Um, and I actually hope that Brian will see this. Maybe he will one day. Uh, he's a great guy. Got some great videos I love watching, but I do disagree with him, and I'm going to call him to task on this. Quit elevating these people you call the founding fathers. Um, they were nothing more than a bunch of assholes that wanted to control people, um, and that's the truth. If that offends you, oh well. I've read from their quotes what they were about. They were about coercion. They wanted to coerce people and make people bend to their will. And that's still being practiced by the United States government today, domestically and in uh, uh, basically in foreign countries, to where the United States government continues to try and get other nations, like right now Iran, to bend to their will. The foreign policy of the United States government is coercion. The United States government is the biggest bully on the face of the earth. So anyway, think about what I've given you. You can look it all up online. The book gives a lot of good information. Conspiracy in Philadelphia, The Broken Covenant of the United States Constitution by Gary North. He goes into this book how many of the founding fathers were Masons. And that again, Masonry, Freemasonry, and the belief in the true Messiah of Scripture, definitely at odds. Masonry, they worship a generic God that anyone, a Buddhist, a Muslim, Hindu, can worship. So it's a pagan religion, not compatible with the Creator that gave us Scripture. But anyway, I don't agree with this conclusion. We do not need a theocracy. What we need are people who will practice personal responsibility, take care of their own house, and don't worry about what your neighbor's doing unless he is setting out to do you harm. Then you have every right to defend yourself and your property against harm. But people just need to worry about their own house and what's going on under their own roof, and not worry about what's going on under someone else's roof. Until next time, this is William Moore, and this has been Beyond the Ties That Bind. Everyone have a wonderful day. Take care.